You would think that after 4 decades with multiple sclerosis, not much would disappoint me. Maybe by now many of you have heard the news about the clinical trial of Evobrutinib, the first of the BTK inhibitors to get this close to the finish line. We were all pretty excited about how it was going to go, and we were even looking forward to maybe within a year or two seeing FDA approval and being able to ask our doctors to prescribe this for us. But then one morning recently, I opened up my email and here's what I saw in my inbox. Well, and Professor G did go on to talk about the results of that trial, and they really weren't very much more encouraging than that headline that you just read. I think Dr. Aaron Boster captures my reactions and feelings pretty darn well in what he says here.
Warning, I'm a bit emotional. Any of you that have followed this channel know that I am very excited about the development of a new class of MS medicine, the BTK inhibitors. Well, we just got top-line data from the first trial to be completed, the Evolution trial, which studied a BTK inhibitor called Evobrutinib against Aubagio. And Evo failed. It didn't do any better in relapse rate. What the heck? Well, the very first trial completed, and this week we were given the top line results. Now, in the clinical trial, the primary outcome measure is the number one thing that you want to compare. And the way these trials are constructed, the primary outcome measure is the frequency of relapses. So how many relapses does the people who are taking Aubagio have compared to Evobrutinib? And then they compare that number. And we just got a top line readout. And it was a negative trial, meaning that the Evobrutinib arm didn't do any better than the Aubagio arm. And that's shocking.
Yeah, I guess I was shocked too and disappointed. I think many of us were, and not least among those who were disappointed would have been the pharmaceutical companies and those who were eager to invest in a drug that had every promise of making quite a lot of money, as you can see here from the two Reuters ads, one some months before the trial was the results of the trial were announced, and one right afterwards. Professor G hits the nail right on the head.
And it's quite worrying because I suppose the negative Evobrutinib trial must make the other companies developing BTK inhibitors in multiple sclerosis, so there are three, and possibly a fourth one starting, because all of them are comparing their agent against teriflunomide, so they may be on tenterhooks. What does this mean for those other trials, and are we surprised based on these Evobrutinib results if those other agents beat teriflunomide?
But we all know things get hyped, right? We've heard it time and again, all these new and exciting developments, and we think, oh, this is the breakthrough we've been waiting for in multiple sclerosis. And then the disappointment. It's getting to be kind of an old and tired pattern. But I think if you dig in just a little bit, you're going to see that this is not quite the end of the story, because actually people might have been a little bit more cautious in their thoughts on this trial than you might think. And I'd like to play something for you right now from the MS Center website. Enrique Alvarez from the University of Colorado, back in April before the phase 3 results were published, discusses his thoughts on this Evobrutinib trial.
Let's talk about some of these phase 3 trials just to kind of give you a little bit of idea. So we don't have data from phase 3 trials. So we have data from phase 2 trials for 2 of these drugs. One is Evobrutinib. This is the one that's a little bit farther ahead. This was a little bit more of our standard phase 2 trial where they looked at multiple different doses, had a placebo. The placebo got switched over after 24 weeks. And we can see that the number of contrast-enhanced lesions or active lesions came down nicely, that the number of new T2 lesions came down nicely. The moral of the story is a little bit here. The numbers from a relapsing perspective were okay. They look like most of our oral drugs. They didn't look necessarily like our infusion drugs. So we'll have to see, what that actually looks like in the big phase 3 trials. How they looked at it was a little bit different. They didn't look at number of lesions. They looked at lesion rate ratios, and it was a very stats type heavy process to look at this. So does the drug look better than this? Does it look worse than this? Again, I think we just need to wait for the phase 3 trials so that we have a better sense to see, like, are these going to be really good drugs or kind of middle of the road drugs or things like that. They've also changed their dosing a little bit. So when they started their phase 3 trial, they went with the 75 once a day, and then they switched it to the 75 twice a day. And so there's a little bit of changes that happened in this trial as we learned about these drugs. So this is one of those things that we use these trials to learn about drugs and how they should be used, once a day dosing, twice a day dosing, what dose. And so just again, this is a very exciting drug class. There's a lot of trials for which we have absolutely no data in progressive disease. So we're going to need to get that data and see what they look like. We're going to have to monitor these liver side effects. I think that's the main side effect that we're really seeing. The original drugs had some bleeding effects. You couldn't take like aspirin with them. That's been removed. So now we can start, it's become much less of a concern. So I think we've been able to eliminate some of that stuff. We'll be able to eliminate the liver stuff, or is that specific to the Bruton tyrosine kinase? We don't know. And then when we have a lot of drugs, from a relapsing perspective, how do they fit? How do we mix and match them with the CD20s? And then from a progressive perspective, we'll just have to see what the data looks like. They might be really good, or they may fall flat.
Well, that actually gave me a better perspective on this trial. But it also makes me want to know, so what is next? And there were several views on that, which I also think will help us not to be too disappointed in those results. First of all, let's hear from a presentation that came out recently from Can Do MS, where they discuss the next steps, what's going to happen now.
The late breaking news that we had today is really early data analysis. The Merck, the company that makes the Evobrutinib, they noted that they still have to do their final analysis. So this process definitely does take time. And generally, when a application is placed in front of the FDA for approval, that takes another 6 to 10 months before they provide an answer. So we are at the earliest of 2025.
The good news with this is knowing that there's additional targets that will drive additional research into different types of treatments. And I think that is true. And researchers are looking at that, because what researchers are now interested in is not so much that inflammatory process. As it turns out, we've got pretty darn good drugs for inflammation. The unmet need is, what do we do about this progressive process that's still happening? And so I think a lot of researchers have turned their attention there, and that's a good thing as far as I'm concerned.
And Professor G has some excellent remarks on the same basic idea. We need to be realistic and maybe even relieved that as much caution is taken as it is with these things, and drugs aren't just rushed out to market. I don't think you should take this as bad news, he says. You know everybody's expecting the next phase of treatments to be BTK inhibitors. But sometimes a failed experiment, a failed result like this, is a time to step back and reflect and consider why it's failed, and also look to explain the failure and then to move on. For this is how science evolves. It's not always about positive results. It's about learning from negative results and using those negative results to improve. So as Professor G says, this is how science works. We learn, or we should learn, as much from our failures as we do from our successes. We need to step back and just think about this test and these results, and why were we surprised? Was it because really the drug didn't perform well? Was it something to do with what we were measuring? Was it something to do with some of the changes that were made midstream, like the presenter from the University of Colorado discussed? There's all kinds of reasons this could be true. And it's also, as Dr. G is quick to point out, It's also kind of nice to know that Aubagio actually performs pretty well, better than anyone thought. Maybe Aubagio is underprescribed rather than the BTK inhibitor being a failure. But the main thing I think we should remember here is that if you look at the clinical trial itself, it was focused on relapsing MS. I think the eligibility criteria were you had to either be diagnosed with relapsing MS or secondary progressive with relapses. And many of us in the more progressive forms of MS haven't had a relapse or a true relapse in years. We weren't really hoping for yet another drug that targeted relapsing MS. Not that I'm being dismissive of drugs that can help people with relapsing MS. Of course I want that. But there are many good ones already. What we really need in the MS community is something that will slow down disability progression, especially since a cure doesn't really look like it's on any kind of time horizon that I even know that I'll be around for. And maybe many of you are in the same boat. So we would really like to see more done with progressive MS. And so this study, because it was targeting on counting relapses, wasn't really measuring what they call progression independent of relapse activity, or PIRA, which is much more characteristic of progressive MS. So the next set of targets in this clinical trial will probably be more helpful to us in looking at that. They'll be looking at some different measures and some different outcomes. Perhaps they'll get to see that the drug has a mechanism of action that benefits those of us who have progressive MS, even if it doesn't stop actual relapses. Let's face it, the clinical trials will continue. There are a whole bunch more, not just on Evobrutinib. They're all looking to come to market because, let's face it, there's money to be made here. And much as I'd like to think that everybody's top priority is finding a way to help people with multiple sclerosis, I just kind of know better than that. If there weren't money to be made, I'm not sure there'd be this much interest. So as long as there's this hope that there's going to be some profit involved, they'll continue to be doing these clinical trials, never fear. And one of them, or even more than one of them, is bound to make it all the way to FDA approval sooner or later. And let's hope it's not too much later. Maybe by the time I get to my 5th decade with multiple sclerosis, they'll actually have something that will help me. But oh well. In the meantime, though, I am going to continue to be hopeful, because I think that's the best way to keep my general health strong, is to just keep a positive attitude about things. And that even though it's good to know what the science is doing and what the state of the research is, let's not be downcast if things don't seem immediately to be going the way we had hoped. Sooner or later, with all of this attention and all of this good science all over the world with all of these brilliant people, sooner or later, a breakthrough worthy of the name will come. I am sure of it. But in the meantime, our job is to take really good care of ourselves. And I'll see you again in my next video.